Every note I sing is a wound I open again. Tim Buckley didn't overdose, he oversang. The apartment was thick with smoke and silence. June 29th, 1975. Santa Monica, California. Late afternoon light filtered through windows that hadn't been cleaned in months, casting shadows across a scene that would become music's most devastating prophecy. A father dying at 28, a son following him into darkness at 30, two voices that burned too bright to last. Tim Buckley lay on a mattress on the floor. Timothy Charles Buckley III, 28 years old, dark hair falling across a face that looked simultaneously ancient and childlike. His body weighed 138 pounds. The coroner would note this detail with clinical precision, would document how years of burning calories through performance rather than consuming food had left him skeletal, translucent, more spirit than flesh. He looked as if he'd just finished a song and forgotten to breathe. On the floor beside him, one syringe, one spoon, residue of heroin mixed with morphine. A combination his body had never encountered. A dosage calculated by friends who should have known better. Something in the room felt wrong. Not grief, inevitability. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. The night before, he'd performed at the Starwood Club. Witnesses described it as transcendent and terrifying, watching Tim's voice climb to octaves that seemed physically impossible. Sustained notes that should have shredded his vocal cords. He sang like someone saying goodbye. He sang as if answering a question his son hadn't yet asked. Like someone who'd finally found the note he'd been chasing his entire life and discovered it was silence. After the show, he went to a friend's apartment. They talked about music, always music, even at the end. About the albums nobody bought. About the son he'd barely met, now 8 years old, listening to his father's records and constructing an image from absence. About sounds he still wanted to explore, notes he'd never reach. Someone mixed morphine into the heroin. Tim had never used morphine before. His body, emaciated and weakened, wouldn't know how to process the combination. The dosage being prepared was dangerous even for experienced users. Tim injected the mixture. Within minutes, his breathing became shallow. His pulse weakened. Friends would later say he looked almost peaceful, like someone finally finding the silence they'd been searching for their entire life. They didn't call an ambulance immediately, paralyzed by fear, by the illegality of what they were doing, by the sudden recognition that they'd just killed someone, however unintentionally. By the time emergency services arrived, Timothy Charles Buckley III was gone. Time of death, approximately 5:01 p.m. Age 28 years, 4 months, 15 days. Weight 138 pounds. Cause of death, acute heroin morphine intoxication. Music isn't made for comfort. 22 years later, on May 29, 1997, his son Jeffrey Scott Buckley would walk into the Wolf River in Memphis, Tennessee, fully clothed, and vanish. The siren called twice. Father answered with a needle. Son answered with a river. Two voices, one fate. The most haunting duet in music history performed across death itself. But to understand how a voice becomes a weapon that kills its owner, we must go back. To the beginning. To a boy born on Valentine's Day who would grow up writing love songs that sounded like prayers for the dying. He was born February 14, 1947 in Washington, D.C. A Valentine's Day baby in a world that would teach him love was always followed by loss. His father, Timothy Charles Buckley Jr., was a decorated World War II veteran who believed emotions were weaknesses, that men expressed themselves through work and silence, never through feelings and certainly never through art. His father fought wars with weapons. Tim would fight wars with songs. Both would come home wounded. The family moved to Anaheim, California, Orange County in the 1950s, where success meant conformity and anything different was dangerous. Tim's father wanted him normal. Sports, a stable job, a conventional life. But Tim had been born with something that couldn't be coached away. A voice that didn't sound like it belonged to a child, that seemed to contain multitudes. People say I sing too high, but that's where the pain lives. At Anaheim High School, he was both celebrated and isolated. He could sing. Everyone agreed on that. But he was also strange, too sensitive, too interested in jazz and poetry when other boys talked about cars and football. His body was too small for the sound inside. He met Mary Guibert when he was 17. She was beautiful, artistic, unconventional. Everything Orange County wasn't. They fell in love the way teenagers do, completely, recklessly, without understanding that intensity isn't sustainability. By 18, they were married. By 19, they had a son. Jeffrey Scott Buckley, born November 17, 1966. Tim looked at the baby and felt something he couldn't articulate. Love mixed with terror, the crushing awareness that fatherhood and artistry might be fundamentally incompatible. He was 19 years old, just beginning to understand that the voice inside him demanded everything, left room for nothing else. The marriage collapsed within months. Tim moved out, chasing music. He would see Jeff occasionally at first, then rarely, then not at all. The guilt haunted him. Friends said it was a low-frequency hum beneath everything he created, a wound that informed every note he sang about love and loss and the impossibility of connection. He didn't abandon his son. He surrendered him to the same muse that was already taking him. Did I dream you dreamed about me? He'd write those words in 1970 in a song called Song to the Siren, ostensibly about mythology, actually about a son he'd abandoned, about love that existed only as an ache, about the distance between father and child that no amount of beauty could bridge. By 1966, at 19, Tim was living the life he'd chosen. Free from domestic obligations, immersed in the Los Angeles folk scene, developing a sound that didn't fit anywhere. He wasn't another folk singer with a guitar. He was something stranger, more ambitious, more dangerous. His debut album, Tim Buckley, released that same year, was good but constrained. Producers trying to make him commercial, trying to fit his voice into conventional structures. Tim hated it. Felt caged. He was already hearing new possibilities, already bored with what he'd just created. The breakthrough came in 1967 with an album called Goodbye and Hello. This was Tim beginning to break free. Songs stretching past 6, 7, 8 minutes. Vocals that suggested he was using his voice not to sing notes but to express emotions too complex for words. The title track was prophetic. Tim saying farewell to the conventional world, announcing arrival into something that didn't have a name yet. Time takes care of the rest, he sang, not realizing he was writing his own epitaph. Critics praised it. Folk fans were confused, and Tim understood something crucial. Mainstream success would require repetition, staying in this commercially viable space. But repetition felt like death. He'd already moved on in his head, already hearing something beyond folk, beyond what audiences expected. Over the next 2 years, he released Happy Sad and Blue Afternoon, albums incorporating jazz improvisation, treating his voice like a horn, bending notes in ways that made folk purists uncomfortable. His audience was shrinking. His artistic vision was expanding. And Tim was making a choice without fully understanding its cost. Creative freedom in exchange for commercial viability, artistic integrity in exchange for the ability to support a child he'd already abandoned. Could a boy whose sensitivity was treated as weakness ever learn to express it without turning it into a weapon? Against the world? Against himself? Was he running toward transcendence? Or simply fleeing from the ordinary life his father modeled? From fatherhood he was too young to understand. The answer came in 1970 in an album that would define both his genius and his doom. Star Sailor wasn't an album. It was an exorcism. Released in November 1970, it represented Tim pushing his voice to places human voices weren't meant to go. He treated his vocal cords as an instrument capable of sounds that defied description, screams that became melodies, whispers that contained oceans. notes that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the human body's capacity. Even silence for Tim had a pitch. The title track alone was nearly 11 minutes of Tim's voice climbing, diving, shrieking, whispering, performing vocal acrobatics that seemed physically impossible. He wasn't singing words. He was channeling pure emotion through sound, using his voice the way an abstract painter uses color. Not to represent reality, but to create realities that couldn't exist otherwise. Recording sessions were legendary for their intensity. Musicians who played on the album described Tim as possessed, as someone who'd stopped being entirely human and become something else, a conduit for sounds that frightened even him. He'd sing for hours, pushing his voice past the point where it should have failed, chasing notes that existed only in his imagination. One engineer recalled, he'd finish a take and there'd be blood in his throat, not metaphorical blood, actual blood, and he'd smile like he'd finally found what he was looking for. The studio became a laboratory for vocal extremes. Tim would arrive at midnight, work until dawn, refusing breaks, refusing water, treating his body like an instrument that needed to be played until it broke. His voice clawed its way out of his ribs. Bass player John Balkan remembered watching Tim record the same passage 17 times, each attempt pushing higher, stranger, further from anything recognizable as human singing. It was like watching someone try to climb out of their own skin, Balkan said years later. Like the voice wanted to exist separate from the body and Tim was trying to help it escape. Between takes, Tim would talk about what he was hearing. Frequencies that existed beyond normal perception. Harmonics that could only be accessed through pain. The idea that true transcendence required destroying the mechanism that produced sound. He wasn't recording songs anymore. He was documenting the sound of breaking. He wasn't chasing perfection. He was chasing disappearance. He spoke about singers in other cultures who damaged their vocal cords deliberately, who believed beauty required sacrifice. His bandmates thought he was theorizing. They didn't realize he was confessing. The album sessions lasted months longer than scheduled. The label grew increasingly nervous. Every day, Tim was further from anything they could market, further from the folk-adjacent sound that had made Goodbye and Hello successful. But Tim couldn't stop, wouldn't stop. He was convinced he was creating something that would change music forever, that would prove the human voice could be more than just a vehicle for melody. It could be pure expression, pure emotion, pure pain transformed into beauty. I am a sailor sailing on. Music critics struggled to describe what they were hearing. One wrote, "This is music of someone who doesn't want to live within human order." Tim reportedly loved that review, saw it as the highest compliment possible. But another critic was more brutal. Buckley has committed commercial suicide. This album will be remembered as the moment he chose artistic purity over career survival. They were both right. Star Sailor sold almost nothing. Radio stations wouldn't play it. Record stores didn't know where to shelve it. Folk fans who'd supported his early work felt betrayed. Jazz audiences found it too experimental even for their tastes. The album existed in a category of one. Tim Buckley making music only Tim Buckley could hear. Elektra Records dropped him. Venues that had been eager to book him started declining. Club owners wanted the guy who'd written beautiful folk ballads, not the guy who spent entire concerts making sounds that seemed designed to disturb rather than comfort. Behind all that experimentation, was there an unbearable loneliness nobody saw? Could someone who pushed his voice to such extremes ever find peace in ordinary communication? And what happens when you've sacrificed everything, marriage, fatherhood, commercial viability, for artistic vision, and that vision leaves you poorer, lonelier, and increasingly convinced you've failed? Tim started using heroin. Not constantly at first, just recreationally the way many musicians in the early 1970s did. It helped with the pain. Not physical pain, but the existential kind. The awareness that he'd destroyed his career in pursuit of something pure and that purity hadn't saved him from anything. Friends from this period describe him as brilliant and broken, capable of profound insights and devastating cruelty, especially toward himself. He was convinced Star Sailor should have been recognized as the masterpiece it was, that the world's rejection proved true art and commercial success were fundamentally incompatible. The irony was painful. He'd achieved complete artistic freedom, the ability to make music without compromise, and it had left him unable to pay rent, unable to see his son, unable to do anything except keep chasing sounds that fewer and fewer people wanted to hear. In 1971, during a rare visit, 7-year-old Jeff asked his father what he did for a living. Tim reportedly answered, "I sing songs nobody wants to hear." Jeff would remember that moment for the rest of his short life, would understand eventually what his father meant, would inherit not just the voice but the curse, the belief that real art requires complete sacrifice, that beauty demands destruction, that transcendence and survival are mutually exclusive. That visit lasted 3 days. Mary had agreed reluctantly, worried about exposing Jeff to Tim's increasingly chaotic lifestyle. Tim picked up his son in a borrowed car, took him to the beach, to recording studios, to the small apartment where he was crashing with other musicians. Jeff watched everything with huge eyes. This stranger who was his father, who everyone treated with a mixture of reverence and concern, who would suddenly start singing in the middle of conversations, testing vocal ranges, chasing sounds that existed only in his head. On the last day, Tim played Jeff some of Star Sailor. The boy sat on the floor listening to his father's voice climb to impossible heights and started crying. Not because he understood what he was hearing, but because something in those sounds communicated more clearly than any conversation they'd had. His father was unreachable, living in frequencies normal people couldn't access, speaking a language that had no translation into ordinary life. "Does it hurt?" Jeff asked. "When you sing like that, does it hurt?" Tim looked at his 7-year-old son and told him the truth. "Every single note, but it's supposed to." Years later, Jeff would tell interviewers about that moment, about understanding even as a child that his father had chosen something beautiful and terrible over choosing him. He'd say it without anger, with something closer to awe. The recognition that some people are born with gifts so demanding they consume everything else, that fatherhood and artistry aren't always compatible, that Tim Buckley singing was more important than Tim Buckley being present. In Jeff's tears that day, Tim finally found an audience of one, the only listener he'd ever truly been singing to. By 1972, Tim Buckley was broke. Not artist broke, actually broke. Behind on rent, borrowing money from friends, unable to afford the heroin that had become less recreational and more necessary. The industry that had once celebrated him as a folk prodigy now viewed him as difficult, talented but unmarketable, brilliant but unbankable. He signed with a new label and released Greetings from L.A., an attempt to be commercial again, to write songs people might actually want to hear. It was funkier, more accessible, but also felt hollow. Tim trying to play by rules he'd spent years breaking, trying to be marketable after teaching himself that commercial meant compromise and compromise meant death. The album did moderately well. Better than Star Sailor, at least. But Tim hated it. Felt like he was betraying everything Star Sailor represented, everything he'd sacrificed for artistic purity. He followed it with Sophronia and Look at the Fool, albums that showed him oscillating between commercial accessibility and experimental impulses, never quite committing to either, increasingly bitter about having to choose at all. Look at the Fool Who Fell. The worst part was the live performances. Club owners wanted hits, wanted Pleasant Street and songs from Goodbye and Hello, the folk material he'd left behind years ago. Tim would perform them, but you could hear the resentment in his voice. The anger at being forced to perform his younger self's work when his current self had moved so far beyond it. "It's like being a ghost," he told a friend. "Like being asked to haunt your own past." The heroin use increased. What had been recreational became maintenance, became the only thing that made performing his old hits tolerable, that dulled the pain of watching younger, more commercially savvy artists achieve the success he deliberately destroyed. His relationship with Jeff remained virtually non-existent. The boy was 8 years old by 1974, being raised by Mary and her parents, constructing an image of his father from album covers and stories. Tim expressed guilt, talked about being a better father someday, but someday kept receding. The drugs changed him in ways beyond the obvious physical deterioration. Friends noticed how his personality would shift, brilliant and warm one moment, cruel and distant the next. The heroin didn't just numb pain, it created distance between Tim and everyone around him, a chemical moat that protected him from having to feel the full weight of his choices. He could talk about Jeff without breaking down, could discuss his failed career without rage, could perform songs he hated without showing contempt. The drugs made it all bearable, which meant they were making him less human, more machine, more capable of going through motions that would have destroyed him if he'd felt them fully. By late 1974, Tim was living in a series of temporary situations, crashing on couches, staying with girlfriends until they tired of his chaos, occasionally finding short-term rentals he couldn't afford to keep. He owned almost nothing: a guitar, some clothes, boxes of master tapes from albums nobody bought, letters from Jeff he couldn't bring himself to answer. His entire existence had condensed down to the essentials: the voice, the drugs, the performances that paid just enough to survive until the next one. Friends staged interventions. Mary called, begging him to get clean for Jeff's sake. His mother wrote letters expressing worry. But Tim had convinced himself that the heroin wasn't the problem. The world's inability to understand what he was trying to create was the problem. The drugs were just medicine for living in a reality that didn't have room for what he was. This belief, more than the heroin itself, is what made him unreachable. He'd reframed his addiction as artistic necessity, his isolation as integrity, his decline as the inevitable cost of refusing to compromise. On the rare occasions they did see each other, Jeff would watch his father with a mixture of awe and confusion. This man who could sing like an angel but couldn't seem to function like a human being. This father who was more concept than presence, more mythology than reality. "I gave you life," Tim said once during a visit that went badly. "But I can't give you anything else. I don't have anything else to give." Jeff was 9 years old. He didn't understand then, but he would. Eventually, he would understand everything. By June 1975, Tim was 28 years old and looked 40. The heroin, the poverty, the years of burning calories through performance rather than consuming food, all of it had taken its toll. His face was gaunt. His voice miraculously remained pristine. That voice that could reach impossibly high notes, that could move through registers that shouldn't exist in human throats. That voice was all he had left, and he was terrified of losing it. June 28, 1975. The Starwood Club, West Hollywood. Tim's final performance. Those who were there describe it as transcendent and terrifying. Tim sang like someone who'd made a decision without consciously realizing it. His voice climbed to registers that seemed impossible, sustained notes that should have shredded his vocal cords, moved through emotions too complex for language. He performed "Song to the Siren," the song he'd written about his son, though nobody in the audience knew that. His voice was impossibly fragile, impossibly beautiful, hanging in the air like something that might shatter if anyone breathed too hard. "Did I dream you dreamed about me?" After the show, friends said Tim seemed peaceful, like someone who'd finally sung everything he needed to say. who'd reached the note he'd been chasing since he was 19 years old and discovered it was the last note, the one that came before silence. He went to a friend's apartment. They talked. They decided to get high. Someone suggested mixing morphine with the heroin. The dosage was wrong. Tim's body, emaciated and weakened, couldn't process it. Within minutes, his breathing became shallow. His pulse weakened. By the time anyone called for help, he was gone. The coroner's report was clinical, precise, utterly inadequate to explain what had actually killed him. Because Tim Buckley didn't die from heroin and morphine, he died from believing that transcendence required destruction, that beauty demanded sacrifice, that the artist must burn completely for the art to be real. He died from a voice that was too big for his body, from a vision that was too pure for the commercial world, from a gift that felt more like a curse. Somewhere in a house in Orange County, 9-year-old Jeff Buckley learned that his father was dead, learned that the man who existed mostly as an absence, mostly as records played late at night, was now only that. Only recordings, only echoes, only a voice preserved in vinyl while the body that produced it turned to ash. Mary held her son as he cried, this woman who had loved 2 Buckley men and would watch both burn in the same fire, consuming themselves for beauty that the world barely noticed. Jeff would spend the next 18 years trying to understand, would listen to Star Sailor obsessively, would study Song to the Siren like a message in code, would eventually realize that his father had been singing to him all along, through songs that pretended to be about other things. The funeral was small. Mary came, bringing Jeff, who stood silently as his father was buried, trying to understand how you mourn someone you barely knew. Friends from the music scene attended, fellow explorers who'd watched Tim push boundaries until those boundaries killed him. The industry that had abandoned him while alive remembered him briefly in death. Obituaries praised his innovations, his fearlessness, his influence on experimental music. Record labels that had dropped him started reissuing his albums, discovering that dead artists are more marketable than difficult living ones. But the real story was just beginning. Jeff Buckley grew up haunted by his father's ghost. He listened to Tim's records obsessively, studied the voice he'd inherited genetically but had to learn technically, tried to understand the man who'd chosen music over family. He inherited not just Tim's voice, though the similarities were uncanny, but also his intensity, his inability to compromise, his belief that art required complete surrender. In the 1990s, Jeff emerged as a musician. His debut album, Grace, showcased a voice that seemed to channel his father's range and emotion while creating something distinct. Critics called him a genius. Jeff called himself his father's son. He covered Song to the Siren. When Jeff sang his father's words, it became a duet across death, a son finally answering a father who'd been calling to him for 20 years through recordings, a conversation that could only happen now that both were doomed. Jeff's relationship with his father's legacy was complicated, public, and ultimately fatal. In interviews, he'd talk about Tim with a mixture of reverence and resentment, love and abandonment, understanding the artistic imperative that made his father choose music over fatherhood while never quite forgiving it. He'd studied every Tim Buckley album, learned the vocal techniques, understood the progression from folk to jazz to experimental chaos. But he'd also lived the consequence, growing up fatherless, constructing an identity around an absence, trying to understand a man who existed more as mythology than memory. When Jeff performed Song to the Siren, audiences who knew both father and son found it unbearable. The genetic similarities were uncanny, not just the vocal range, but the timbre, the way certain notes broke, the physical mannerisms while singing. It was as if Tim Buckley had been reincarnated, given a second chance, but doomed to follow the same trajectory. Jeff knew it too. Would joke darkly about the Buckley curse, about voices that were too beautiful to sustain, about how some families inherit eye color and others inherit self-destruction. In his final interviews months before his death, Jeff talked about feeling his father's presence more intensely, about dreams where Tim would appear, still 28, still beautiful, and they'd sing together, the conversation they never had in life, expressed through harmony instead of words. About understanding finally that his father hadn't chosen music over him. His father hadn't been capable of choosing anything. The voice had chosen Tim, had used him completely, and was now using Jeff the same way. Neither of them were artists making choices. They were instruments being played by something larger, more demanding, more merciless than human will. Every wound I open becomes a note my son will one day sing, Tim had said once, not realizing he was prophesying across death itself. May 29, 1997. Wolf River, Memphis, Tennessee. Jeff Buckley walked into the water fully clothed. He started swimming. He vanished. Age 30 years, 6 months, 12 days. Cause of death, drowning. What the father sought in the needle, the son sought in the current, both looking for weightlessness. Two voices that burned too bright to last. Two men who treated their gifts as weapons against themselves. Two lives that proved some inheritances can't be escaped, that some curses pass from father to son like genetic code. That beauty can be deadly when it demands everything and gives back only the briefest moment of transcendence before the silence returns. Tim's grave in Santa Ana Cemetery is simple. For years it received few visitors. Then Jeff died, and suddenly people came to pay respects to both father and son, to two voices that had touched something profound and painful. Star Sailor eventually became recognized as the masterpiece Tim always believed it to be, not commercially, but artistically. Experimental musicians and avant-garde composers acknowledge it as a breakthrough that expanded what human voices could express. Robert Plant cited him. Elizabeth Fraser of Cocteau Twins studied his techniques. Radiohead acknowledged his experimentation. But perhaps his greatest legacy, his most unbearable gift, was Jeff. The son he barely raised carried forward the voice, the intensity, the beauty, and the curse. When Jeff sang, people heard Tim. When Jeff died, people understood that some gifts kill everyone who receives them. The question haunts both lives. Was their shared fate coincidence? Or was there something in that voice itself, that ability to express the inexpressible, that made ordinary survival impossible? His final words, spoken to friends that last night, were about sounds he still wanted to explore, notes he'd never reach. He died doing what he'd always done, chasing something just beyond his grasp, convinced that the next note, the next high, the next transcendent moment would finally be enough. It never was. The official record says Tim Buckley died of an accidental overdose, but accidents don't explain the pattern. The life spent deliberately alienating audiences, destroying commercial viability, choosing art over family, pushing his voice past human limits as if trying to escape the body that constrained it. He was Timothy Charles Buckley III, the Valentine's Day baby who never learned gentle love. He was the boy from Orange County whose voice didn't fit anywhere. He was the teenage father who chose music over fatherhood. He was the folk messiah who destroyed folk music. He was the jazz explorer who made jazz uncomfortable. He was Star Sailor, the man who tried to sing his way out of human existence and almost succeeded. Some nights in small clubs where experimental musicians still gather, people swear they can hear it. That voice, impossibly high, unbearably beautiful, singing notes that seem to come from somewhere beyond human capacity, not from old recordings, from somewhere deeper. Somewhere Tim finally reached after his body gave out. His son heard it too, before he died. Jeff would tell interviewers about feeling his father's presence in certain moments, hearing Tim's voice overlaying his own, understanding finally what his father had been chasing and why that chase was fatal. Somewhere in a club at 2 a.m., A singer hits a note too high and holds it too long, and for a second the room goes silent because everyone feels it. That presence, that voice, that ghost who proved beauty could be deadly when it demanded everything. Tim Buckley didn't want to last. He wanted to burn. And he did. Brilliantly, terribly, completely. He burned through folk music and jazz and experimentation and his own body, burning until there was nothing left but recordings and a sun who would follow the same bright flame to the same dark end. He said it. He lived it. And in living it, he created something that endures precisely because it was never meant to. Beauty so intense it required destruction. Art so honest it couldn't survive contact with the ordinary world. A voice so powerful it consumed both the man who wielded it and the son who inherited it. That voice still echoes. In experimental music, in underground clubs, in his son's recordings, in the work of every artist who chooses integrity over survival, who believes beauty requires sacrifice, who understands that some gifts demand everything and give back only the briefest moment of transcendence before the silence returns. The coroner wrote acute morphine heroin intoxication. The tape still played Song to the Siren. Maybe that's all anyone gets. A few years of burning, a few albums that barely anyone hears, a voice that reaches heights others can't imagine, and then darkness. Maybe Tim Buckley got exactly what he wanted, to be heard, truly heard by the few who could understand, and to escape before the gift became routine, before the burning became merely warm. He lived every note until they killed him, and somewhere, in the space between father and son, between 1975 and 1997, between the needle and the river, a siren still sings, calling to artists who feel too much, who sing too high, who believe transcendence is worth dying for. The answer was always yes. Father dreamed of son dreamed of father. Both dreamed of a note that existed just beyond reach, in that space where beauty and death become indistinguishable, where the voice finally breaks free of the body that constrained it. They're singing together now. Somewhere. A duet that can only exist in silence, in the space between notes, in the echo that remains after the final breath. Two voices, one fate, the most haunting harmony in music history. For 22 years, silence filled the space between one breath and the next. Does every artist with a voice that reaches heaven have to destroy the body that carries it? If beauty always demands blood, are we, the listeners, complicit in the sacrifice?